Welcome to the Media Roundtable Industry Edition, where we dive into the secrets of the craft and provide our perspective on industry topics in service of marketers responsible for the success of their audio program. I'm your host, Stu Redwine, Executive Creative Director at Oxford Road. Today, we are joined by our fellow agents of influence, Bart Roselli, EVP Media at Oxford Road.
Great to be here.
Great to have you here. And Courtney O'Connor, Director, Podcast Media at Oxford Road.
Thank you for having me, Stu.
Thanks for being here. This is great. And last but certainly not least, the one and only, the international man of mystery, Giles Martin, EVP Strategy, Oxford Road.
Great to be here with you guys. Thank you for having me.
I think we've got a fantastic crew here to kick off the year. So welcome to the show. All right, let's break down this week's top industry news stories. This first one, what an ominous title. Is it the end of ads in podcasting? Bart, what can you tell us about that?
I can first start with a humorous ha-ha, but that is not going to happen. I think one of the statements made about like DAI flooding the supply is definitely a factual piece. So end of podcasting, not with the linear growth we're seeing from a year-over-year perspective and the performance and response we see. But I do think the pieces of ethical responsibility in terms of ad load plays a large factor. And it becomes more prominent when that becomes just way too convoluted and we see the direct correlation in response. So podcast ads die. No, I can't even take that with a serious response. But there are factual statements about ad load and pieces of those puzzle that we have to keep a close eye on, and we are forced to. We're a performance marketing business. Our clients need to see a return on their investment, and those pieces have a direct correlation into whether we buy them, how we approach them, etc.
It also seems like there's a point in there about, the AI content generation. And, it's not a problem that's specific to podcasting by any means, as we all know. But as more and more content gets churned out that is low quality and, available to be monetized, I think there is more risk for brands that if you're going into these waters without proper navigation, you could end up really wasting your money or ending up on type of content that, is going to not just not perform, but also potentially just reflect poorly on you and your brand. So, again, that's a much bigger than podcasting space. We know YouTube and Spotify, like there's tons of content that's, not being, generated by humans, and a lot of it is poor quality. So obviously that's something to be aware of.
I also think it's a little bit about learning from our mistakes too, where we kind of have to test, learn, and grow, and thinking about we are still in maybe the adolescence of this medium. And so we are still learning, evolving, and growing. And I kind of see this of the very hard lessons that a lot of us had to learn during the big boom after 2020 and in 2021. You kind of have to pull back and think through some of the choices that we've maybe made because the industry is scaling so much. So is it the end of ads? No, but I do think that it's potentially an end of an era or a evolving era into improving ads in podcasting too.
So I think what's fascinating is that the premise of Dave Jackson's article here, is it the end of ads in podcasting? Will podcasters be stuck punching the monkey? From Podcasting Observations on January 2nd is his comparison to banner ads. And none of you even honored that comparison. Is he just completely off base there? Is it just, it's a different channel? What do you even think of his comparison to it being like the collapse of banner ads?
It's a powerful metaphor. It's exaggerated to put it
Yeah,
mildly.
a bit sensationalist. I mean, I do think the general point about sort of podcasting becoming more like radio is a point that we've been making for a long time, in the sense of, when I joined the industry in 2018, podcasts, the ad load on podcasts was much lower than it is now. And shortly after that time, you had all these major acquisitions, like all these indie podcast companies were acquired by, iHeart and, Spotify and others. And they were monetizing, maybe 20 minutes of their programming hour with ad content, and they'd paid all of this money to get into the podcasting space with these massive acquisitions. And a lot of these companies were maybe monetizing 2 minutes an hour or 3 minutes an hour. So having paid all this money, like there has been this sort of long history of like trying to catch up to radio, trying to pay off those investments and trying to make it worthwhile. In terms of getting that ad load comparable. So I don't think it's still way lower than radio in many cases, and I still think that there's going to be pressure from publishers and their financial interests to push up that monetization further and further. But I mean that's just the story of all media, isn't it? Like that's just kind of how it goes, right? And it's just finding that balance. And um, I think podcasting's done a pretty good job of that so far, but it's not going to go away.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that he reached for something that's like parallel or another channel where it's like you could talk about radio as a comparison point, which I think is a better comparison point with 100 years of history of people listening to audio and how that has evolved into what we know as commercial radio and those massive ad blocks. Like that feels like it, where he's making this point about how they're skippable, which brings us to the next story. There's a tool that's copying podcasts and stripping the ads and then selling them, which there are questions right there on, how long can that sustain, where UK-based podcast ad block uses AI
Never trust a Brit.
to strip ads from major publishers' shows, and then he resells them ad-free. I think the most interesting part about this, and sort of was baked into the first article, is Dave Jackson is talking about how we can skip ads and this functional aspect of podcasts. And then here's this guy doing it in a way that nobody would really expect necessarily, but now somebody's doing it. What I think is interesting is this will create pressure to protect those ad blocks so that you won't be able to do that. The industry response will accelerate authenticated reads and DRM, pushing podcasting further toward closed ecosystems that benefit Spotify and YouTube over open RSS. And I think they're spot on with that. So on the one hand, it's kind of like it's punk rock. It feels like the podcasting spirit of like, yeah, let's just cut out those ads. But it's like by doing this, you're going to bring about even quicker the very thing that you're trying to eliminate. So the idea could be that you want to make better ads that people won't want to skip or whatever. I can tell you as the host of Ad Infinitum, where we listen to real ads that are in the wild, ads that we do, and then ads that everybody else does. The tough thing is podcasting really is becoming more like radio. So yeah, this might have a moment where you're able to cut out the ads, but the longer arc of it seems to be that the ad breaks there's more ad breaks and there's more ads in those ad breaks that are sounding like radio ads. And like, do you guys think, like, Courtney, is there any way to stop podcasting from becoming the worst of commercial radio?
Yeah, I think that we go back to not having as like strict and long ad blocks. If the ad is in content and it's a little bit more seamless with what the hosts are talking about, and then they slip into an ad read, me as a podcast listener, I'm not as inclined to reach for my phone or go find it in the kitchen when I'm doing something and skip forward. But if I know that I'm entering a block where there's going to be 3 straight minutes of ads, it makes sense for me to go find my skip it. Not saying that I skip ads, but I do think that spacing them out and having them a little bit more in content, which we've moved away from as obviously the space has grown and monetization has been a really big thing. But I do think that there is a way to kind of go back to the grassroots of how we've built this industry while maintaining the monetization aspect. From an advertiser's perspective, I believe it is more valuable and potentially more premium to be one of one versus one of four. So that's kind of how I look at it, especially from like a buyer's perspective too.
I think it's also interesting too, Stu, is like the people who have helped build podcasts have a traditional media background. So they're also familiar with how those ecosystems were built. In any conversation Courtney and I have, they're mindful of it. There comes a cause and effect balance of they paid XYZ to acquire said show or to represent said show. They have to make a return. Or are they part of a larger, much bigger company who's writing off some of that cost? And maybe there's less reliance for sales to return on that investment. And for us, the decision is very simple comparative to even when you're thinking about radio, is there's a finite number of people you would make a phone call to build a radio plan. There's borderline hundreds. You could do that in podcasts. So if we don't like the ad environment, we don't like the response, we just don't buy it. So there is a cause and effect element that I think, and accountability that I think is beneficial to the channel that maybe the other traditional channels didn't have a chance to kind of like navigate themselves.
Giles, do you have anything you want to add on that?
I just think the most interesting piece of this is, why did this guy agree to an interview with James Cridland? Because it seems like the most obviously illegal activity in the business that we've heard about for quite a long time. Um, you know, it seems like there should be something probably illegal to stripping the ads out of other people's content, and then you're taking their content and reselling it to someone else without any rights. Like there's not a lot of stuff that looks good here. So I imagine this is going to go away pretty quickly. But I mean, yeah, it does touch on some of these other issues around, the quality of the content and what people would do to, make sure the quality of their content is good. And, in some cases that involves, I think the big question is, and I know the industry's sort of flirted with this before, but like, how much might people be willing to pay to avoid ads? That's really the question.
Apparently $1.99 a month.
$1.99, yeah.
I mean, we've also heard that 6 years ago, where everyone's like, oh,
Yeah.
we're going to do the paywall thing, whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I'll believe it when I see it. Now, outside of massive platforms, that's a little bit different, but it's a free environment. That is what they are used to. And how they support them is through advertisements and through sponsors from that perspective. So I think that symbiotic relationship works really well to keep accountability, but I don't see like this massive shift to paywall and people are like, you know what, I want to go this because I want to avoid ad. It's like we get exposed to ads nonstop throughout our life. Like I don't think they're another monthly fee.
And one of the main stories around that of the past like 5 years is like, yeah, people pay to avoid ads, and then like on Spotify you still get the podcast ads, or on Netflix now you get ads. It's like, sorry guys, like the ads are coming. Whether you can run, but you can't hide.
Yep.
Yes, the ads are coming. The ads are coming. A couple other interesting tidbits about this is they've claimed 78,735 hours of ads removed, which calculated is about almost $1 million in lost revenue. And then the other sort of cherry on top is founder Ben Bowler also runs Poison Pill to protect music from unlicensed AI scraping. Oh.
You couldn't write this.
It's like the guy that made the radar gun for the police. He also made the fuzzbuster for us to put in our car so that you could sense it. It's like, oh, Mr. Bowler, you're on both sides of this. Yeah, I imagine this is short-lived. And it flashed in my head like, wow, what if there was somebody 40 years ago that would record your favorite channel on VHS and take out all of the ads and then send you the tape, right? It's like, anyway, it's the ads are coming. The ads are coming. That is definitely true. And also YouTube is coming. YouTube, this next story we have, Courtney's going to tell us about. The Living Room podcast viewing hits 700 million hours. What do you think of that?
Wild. Well, we know video has been here, but YouTube is now saying that video is shifting to the living room, which is very interesting, and is up 75% year over year on hours consumed on TV connected devices. And they're reporting almost 1 billion monthly podcast viewers, which again is crazy. But YouTube isn't the only player in the game. Netflix has entered the chat. They're securing exclusive deals with players like Spotify and Barstool and iHeart. And then iHeart announced that they're also looking to launch video via RSS. So YouTube's dominance is certainly being pressure tested here. So they are enhancing a lot of their features and making some really interesting improvements. For CAOs listening, it's important to note that they are expanding their commerce features with QR code shopping and timed product placement. So we all know YouTube's doubling down, but the living room aspect I think is really interesting. And then others are kind of racing to jump into the game. But I think an interesting question to pose to the group here is, does this replicate CTV? Does it make sense to continue buying CTV and podcast separately? Because podcast has kind of entered the streaming discussion.
Are we seeing any of our media partners start to break out like TV impressions as a separate kind of CPM or separate category? No, not yet. Interesting. Okay.
Once in a while, but I think it's more like they're asking the question with like a question mark at the end of it. Like, does this pass the sniff test? I think it's still too early. I think they're going to any impression that they could make is what And the big thing is when stuff's moving, is the entire RSS feed moving? And then that show might live there for 2 or 3 years. When you go back, it's no longer there in some of those cases. So there's just a lot to happen, I think, here. And I think we're already exposed to the QR coding when we sit at our TV and we're rolling through Amazon and every single ad has a QR code. And I'm just like making sure my wife's not like has her phone up. So there's not something being purchased, but I think it's one step at a time here too.
So one thing I'm wondering about is those 700 million hours. I mean, that's a big stat. Like, how many of those do you think are just the top shows with big visual budgets, or is that representative of when someone thinks podcasting, they think it's two people having a conversation? It's like all these shows. Or are we really talking about it's the biggest shows with big budgets that, of course, you want to watch on the big screen?
Right. Or I think the other question to ask and what I wonder is, are they watching it or are they putting it on their living room TV to then
Yeah.
like, I think that that's, like, been a big thing of you want to cater to the video viewer, but you also wanna make sure that you're catering to that audio-only listener, and I am someone that puts things on my living room TV, and then I walk away, and I just listen to it in the background, and so I do think that's an interesting thing to think about. So if maybe the intention is going to be more video focused watching when it's on a streamer like Netflix, because the habit is to go to Netflix and sit down and consume something. So that will be very interesting. But we're at the early stages. I don't know that anything Netflix officially has launched all that much. Barstool, I know, is happening this quarter. Spotify, I believe, is happening this quarter. So I think we have a lot to learn this year on the streamer.
There's a couple of really interesting points there, and I also have a stat because I did some research about this. The point about the sort of needs to work as video, needs to work as audio, sort of you were sort of hinting at that, Courtney. And Dan was talking about breakfast TV back in the day, like when that was first made, and it was like you're getting ready for work, you're rushing around, like you may sit down, and maybe you're having cereal or something, maybe you sit down in front of the TV, you'll watch it for a minute, but you also may be running around trying to get the kids ready, and so maybe you're listening to it, or maybe at some point you can't hear it, but maybe you can just see it, and it kind of needs to work in all of these different formats, and so they've designed it to work where it's like it's got these types of visuals where you can see sort of pieces of information, but it also kind of works as audio, and then it also kind of works as a TV experience, and I think that's something really interesting for advertisers and for content creators generally, I guess, to be thinking about in this new era. And it kind of has to work everywhere. And it makes me also think of, I can't remember who it was, but somebody had written an article probably around this point last year when they announced the 400 million number, about these late night TV shows sort of being under threat and their ratings are down. Like over the past few years, like 50% or more. Like, I mean, the audience is fleeing. Like Colbert's been canceled altogether. And kind of the point that they were suggesting was, that interview format show, like your Rogan type show, is the new Colbert. And like people can just turn it on Netflix in the evening, and it's sort of becoming a replacement. And so, again, sort of really interesting thinking about sort of what this means for the future of the channel. And, when I saw the 700 million number, I had to go and do a little bit of, and this is very quick and dirty back of envelope math, but like it's a 75% increase, but it's easy to get an increase off, a tiny number, and it's much harder to get a big percentage increase if you're already doing $300 billion of revenue a year. So I, wanted to go and check the numbers, and I was kind of surprised. 68 hours of CTV per month per US adult on average. 270 million roughly US adults makes for about 18.2 billion hours of CTV viewing per month. So if podcasts is 700 million hours of that, I was thinking like this is going to be like 0.1% of like the CTV viewing, but it's actually nearly 4%. So, I mean, that shows how significant this is, I think, already. And I'm just glad that we're sort of on top of this and talking about it and sort of thinking about new ways to execute it. And I think somebody had made the point, maybe in our notes or maybe a moment ago, about sort of new ways to sort of engage in that type of video content. And I know obviously YouTube are doing this type of thing a lot. I guess it's coming to CTV a lot more frequently as well. But sort of once the ads become video, there's different ways to interact with the ads, like direct ability to sort of purchase as part of the ad experience. We mentioned QR codes, so maybe it's even clickable if it's like more of a desktop rather than TV experience. But anyway, just so many ways to engage, so much change coming, and exciting times. I mean, for the business, lots of advertisers to be thinking about. You definitely want to be, guided carefully and planning carefully.
I think what Court and I see from like a financial perspective is people hear video, they think higher CPMs. And the same thing from like a CTV perspective, what it will come down to is we will quickly find out from a performance perspective if that level of attentiveness justifies that premium cost. We know that's how the marketplace is going to be responding, but same thing with any of the evolution that we saw in podcasts is they're going to try it out. The marketplace will tell you if you're in reality or not, but it is going to start out at a higher premium for that engagement and to run the ad. And then the performance will be pretty darn clear for us to see that. And then at some point it will stabilize. It's just where are we going to start? Or is it going to land? But not uncommon from videos first started getting introduced back in, I don't know, 5-6 years ago as well too.
Well, I even think like to add to that, and the benefit of it is in some cases you're kind of getting a commercial by a celebrity or a well-known podcast host that maybe is not as highly produced as a regular television commercial would be, but you are getting a commercial read by and in most cases endorsed if you're a buying host at a much lower price than you would a standard TV commercial. So like that, although not an apples to apples comparison, I do think it's very interesting and has been the value and the like really cool part about podcasting is it becomes a far more accessible.
Tell me if you've ever heard of any of these companies. Shopify, DraftKings, Oracle, Warby Parker, Mint Mobile, Quince. I am proud to say that half of the top 10 advertisers in podcasting choose to work with Oxford Road. We are now the world's largest podcast advertising agency, and we do so much more than that. YouTube, radio, streaming. We are on 6 continents working internationally. Reach out to us. We'll tell you about Woven, which is probably the world's largest database of show information that's relevant for brands. Orbit, which is $1.6 billion of aggregated performance data used to de-risk every single campaign. Audiolytics, where we can actually measure ad copy and optimize it to maximize performance. We got a lot going on over here. That's why you can read about us in the Wall Street Journal or the Hollywood Reporter or USA Today or Business Insider. But whatever you need, we try to bring thought leadership that matters to you. Sign up for our newsletter that is called The Influencer. When you go to oxfordroad.com, you can always learn more at the Media Roundtable podcast. We got a lot of interesting content. If you just want to learn about this business, and if you don't care, but you just need somebody to make sure that you're getting outcomes that only we can deliver, go to oxfordroad.com and learn more. And make sure you mention the Media Roundtable because attribution. That's oxfordroad.com.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what is amazing to me about this is that it boggles the mind to imagine like Stephen Colbert going into a live read ad, right? And giving a personal endorsement and demonstrating a product. Or watching Kevin Harlan, let's say he's calling a game and then during the break he goes right into talking about an energy drink. It's so cool to me that the broadcast, for whatever reasons and market forces, did not make that decision. And then this punk rock medium on-demand audio came up that's now become video, and that's baked in. So as it's supplanting broadcast, also those ad units are coming with it, which I think is really cool and is part of whatever form it ends up taking. I feel like that's what's baked into the word podcast, is that I'm listening to a real person and that real person is going to tell me about something that they really use in their life. And like that is just like part and parcel. And there's still a bunch of opportunity there. In fact, there's a full report that has just come out that is uniquely named the podcast advertising opportunity. Giles, would you like to tell us about that?
Well, this is eMarketer's latest report about the podcast space, and obviously it's pretty high level, but I thought it's interesting to review and to sort of see the perspective that they are sharing with brands and sharing with advertisers. Some of the main stats, they're forecasting $3.14 billion in spend in 2026. That's good, healthy forecast. That's about 40% of all digital audio advertising. So that's quite a sort of that was a sort of eye-opening moment for me. I mean, I guess, we know these numbers, but just kind of seeing it written like that, like it's getting close to half of all digital audio advertising. So really a lot of growth there. A few things that stood out for me, they do this report on the amount of ad spend per hour spent with a channel. So, social media, for example, has an enormous amount of ad spend, but it also has an enormous amount of people using it and an enormous amount of time on average that those people use it. So if you look at all of that sort of person time on that media channel, and you compare it to the total ad spend in the US, like how much money is being spent per hour used. And I always think this is an interesting chart. And we talked about this a bit at CAO in July. But ad spend per hour for social is 70 cents per hour for across all the people and all the hours consuming it. Whereas podcasts is 6 cents. So relative to the amount of consumption of the media channel, podcast is so much less, used by advertisers, and there's so much more white space relative to so many incredibly cluttered advertising environments. And of course, it could be function of media pricing and these types of things as well. But I think it sort of makes a general point, touching on also what we talked about earlier about, ad load in podcasts, like it still is generally a very favorable and attractive space for advertisers. And that was a sort of very sobering stat I thought about, just how attractive an advertising opportunity it is for marketers still. I mean, I could talk about a lot of these data points, I guess, just because this is sort of how I roll. 58% of marketers said they feel audio and podcast ads outperform benchmarks, which was a lower number than I expected. More marketers, like 70%, said, CTV is a more effective channel. And social media is, 75%, 77%. And initially, that sort of gave me some cause for concern. And then I remembered that if you look at the channels that marketers think are effective, and then you look at the channels that have been sort of reviewed across many sort of MMMs across many brands and many categories and MTA studies and all these types of things. And, Nielsen and Ubiquity have published studies about this. Like there's a pretty strong inverse correlation between what marketers think works and what these studies actually show works. So then I was able to breathe a sigh of relief and in fact realize that the fact that a lot of marketers think that podcasts like really isn't that great compared to many channels actually is probably a good thing for podcasts because marketers tend to be
would you agree? Because I would say when you think about MMM and stuff that's like behind a curtain, we don't always have like full access into how that's like deployed. Is for the longest time, podcast was just never showing up as something that could be tracked or valued probably the same way. I'd say in the last year or two, it feels like it's getting a better due, even to the point where some clients are pushing back and saying, I know that's not true. And sometimes we've pulled spend off completely to prove that point. Like, okay, well, that's true. And that's what these data points are saying. We'll go on hiatus and we'll see what happens. Not as anything other than like, well, let's prove it out. And some clients are very strong about it. Some have, very much rely heavily on that. But I think it has changed. Have you seen or felt that from your perspective looking at these data points?
Well, I do feel that just because of the maturity of the channel, like a lot of these analytics companies are taking podcasts a bit more seriously, whether they're sort of, high ticket analytics companies or more software as a service type. I think they're taking it more seriously. I think they're starting to pay a bit more attention. One of the unique challenges with podcasts, which I don't think you would have with any other media really in a MMM is, the data that we're reporting, it's not an actual impression that's being served at that time. Like it's a download. So we don't, and in every other, channel, it's a genuine impression. And therefore the impression being reported has a chance to make an impact at that time. And, afterwards, there's some type of response curve that's assumed, but that makes podcasting more difficult in MMMs out of the gates. And again, it requires a bit of special attention. But I think that people are starting to pay attention, and we're starting, I think, generally to see more models show favorable results for podcasting. So I'm definitely encouraged about that. And yeah, MMMs can be slippery and often going really big or doing something dramatic like pulling your spend. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but like making big changes, like you have to vet and validate what these MMMs say. And they may say podcasting is great, or they may say it's doing nothing, but like it doesn't mean anything until you can see that for yourself. And a lot of marketers know that it's working, and they've seen it and they trust their gut. It's always art and science, and you can't just blindly trust these models. You have to sort of experiment and test and trust what you know.
So just coming off of the data points that Giles was calling out, is it's interesting that they say it's trailing social, which is predominantly not a sole pure, drop down menus and codes and things of that nature. It's not the most commercialized from that. There obviously is affiliate links and things of that nature, but interesting as some socially specifically is high engagement. I think what we're starting to look at and factor into what we're doing is engagement in terms of how that is happening from the video and from social. I mean, social handles could be the show handle, could be personal handles too, just to try to further triangulate. And it's not black and white clean. The more fragmentation there is, the more triangulation there's going to be. But I think engagement's going to be a big piece that we'll stay closer on to further validate the output of what these ads are doing.
Yeah.
And I've got a question, Giles. If the 58% of marketers feel audio and podcast ads outperform benchmarks, like what do you think that number is in reality? Like if they knew, what would it be? Would it be 80? Would it be 90?
Well, I mean, the types of
127?
studies that I'm talking about, and I can't bring the specific details to mind, but there was a big study done by Nielsen that looked at all of the MMMs they had done across many clients. I think that they found that radio and audio was the second most effective channel for ROI after, I think, TV. And Ubiquity did a study, I think it was more UK based, but they found basically very similar results, like radio and audio is like top 1 to 2 for ROI. So I think number 2. So I mean, that doesn't exactly answer your question, but it does at least sort of answer the spirit of it, I think.
Well, it does. Like I look at this chart, which we can describe to our listeners and viewers, which shows social media reels, social media feeds, connected TV, CTV, commerce media networks, audio and podcast. You're saying audio and podcast goes up to the number 2 spot, TV goes to the number 1 spot, and then everything else would probably follow underneath that, is what you're saying.
And more than that, like, because those types of studies, Nielsen and like they would have looked at lots of media channels. You only got 5 channels represented here. So radio would have been, audio would have been top of, maybe a list of 10 or 15 instead of only the 5 that are represented here, or close to the top.
Well, it's obviously a channel we have all bet our careers on. We believe in, we know works. We think it's so cool when you see their eyes light up when they discover this secret weapon. It's pretty awesome. Marketers, founders, whoever it is. And we live in the adult world where we are investing other people's money and we need proof. The good news is there is more and more proof every day. In fact, DAX US partners with Disco to bring advanced brand lift measurement, which is so important, to digital audio and cross-channel campaigns. Bart, can you tell us about how that will positively impact the very thing we're talking about?
Yeah, I think this is great. I think it shows a very proactive approach from one of the larger aggregators of impressions out there. Is that, in the past and for rightful cases, not necessarily wrong, is that there always have to be a substantial investment to justify adding kind of a lift study in here. And this is now just saying, why does that need to happen? I want to prove that it's valuable for everyone, regardless of what you're spending. And that's factually true because that's how podcasts got to the big numbers. Is those campaigns didn't start out where everyone's like, you know what, I trust your guys' judgment. Here's $1 million. Like, go have some fun. Like, that is definitely not what happened. So the proactive approach here, I think, is just prudent and pragmatic by them to do that and to say, we believe in it so much, we're going to invest the money and we're going to basically prove exactly what we already know. And we're going to even basically pay for it as a result to further validate the channel, which I think is just a very proactive, push, especially from a digital perspective, with more dollars pouring in and the ability to like monetize it even further.
Yeah, it's good to see. And, the sort of brand metrics are tricky because ultimately, our clients and their bosses, they need to see clicks and conversions and visits. And, the brand metrics are, nice to have at best. And tying those brand metrics to subsequent, financial metrics, I think is one of the key sort of tasks of our age. And some of these more advanced analytics companies claim to be able to do that, but he's probably still a bit overhyped. But, the fact remains that if you look at any of the studies that have been done by, the Signal Hills or the Edisons or the Nielsen's, like the brand metrics for podcasting are always phenomenally good compared to other channels. Like the consideration, the familiarity, the memorability, like they are extremely good. And I think we probably do undersell the channel a bit to our clients, even though these brand metrics are secondary, because podcasting is doing so much for your brand. And, brands do have a value. It's just, hard to put your finger on exactly how much that is sometimes. So it's really good to see more of this type of measurement come into the space, and hopefully we can use it to support the value of the channel even more. And I look forward to learning more about what they're doing.
Yeah, and it's great to have brand metric tools, that we can rely on. For a while, for me, it was like if your brand gets mentioned in an SNL skit, then you've mentioned yourself enough in like Blue Apron.
That's
in podcasting. It's like, there's your brand lift. SNL just talked about your brand. You know what I'm saying?
Your viral
Oh
moment.
man, the good old days. And it's awesome to see podcasting expanding. And as it does that internationally, which is a thing that all of us are involved in, which is super cool. It's booming massively in lots of different countries. One in particular is India. And one of those stories that makes you go, ugh, came out this last week or so is podcasts boom in India, paid interviews raise transparency concerns. Per the Economic Times, some guests pay 15 to 30,000 US dollars to appear on India's most watched podcasts, rarely disclosed to audiences. And that pay to play scandal is the kind of thing that can cut directly at what makes a channel valuable. It cuts away at the trust and can inhibit the growth into those international markets. And it's just something that we have to keep an eye on as we are expanding internationally. And thankfully has not been a big part of the story here in the United States of America. But in general, when you guys think about expanding internationally, for the chief audio officers that are listening, how does one take a thoughtful approach to that to avoid these kind of pitfalls?
I mean, I would say the first piece is, and it's been this way for I think years since like the podcast growth has gone internationally, is just with us educating them on what are the standards that are best to us, and then making sure there's either technology that executes against that, or if there are things that we need to be cognizant of, that we use that so we can be ultimately transparent with the buying team, the planners, but more importantly, the clients, and just truly understanding that, kind of like back in the day when everyone's like, oh, well, that CPM's $7. You're like, this one's 20. Like, I don't want to buy the $20 one. I want to do this. It's like, you got to be transparent. You got to educate as part of that. So I think that it's not directly the same, but it does have similar like approaches where it's us doing the due diligence to flesh those pieces out and make sure we're not missing anything. This is an interesting story because it's talking about like interviewing and things of that nature, which does happen domestically as well too. And it still comes back to the performance angle and lens that we're looking at on behalf of clients.
I also think it's just kind of wild to see the value in which it holds to be a guest on one of these podcasts. Like 15 to $30,000 to appear means that they have a lot of people tuning in. That interview is going to be worthwhile for that person to appear. So I think that that's very interesting, maybe from like a non-buyer's perspective, that there's a lot of value in these podcasts, even in countries like India.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool to think of that as a there's the dark side of the story and like, oh no, erosion of trust, but there's kind of the cool like just marketplace reality of like, wow, it's valuable. So if we can get the right, stuff in place that we stop any funny business, this is a valuable channel in India. Giles, did you have an international thought? Well, I guess all your thoughts are international.
Thank you. Yes, thanks. I feel seen. I mean, yes, 15 to 30K, it's a lot of money. There's an awful lot of people in India. I think it's like nearly 1.5 billion. now. And I guess that's the point. And it's not just India; it's everywhere. Like Latin America, we've talked a lot about over the last year or two. There's an enormous amount of growth in podcast consumption and content creation, all over the world. And I think the international market is beginning to rival the size of the US market. So yeah, it's crucial for marketers that can easily expand into international markets to be considering these types of opportunities. It's a great area for growth. We're seeing clients have a lot of success. I mean, I can't comment that much on the sort of authenticity of the content issue, but just generally speaking, yes, you're looking for areas where there's good quality content, where people trust the content, where there's scale, and also where you can measure. And actually, sort of measurement is a big challenge. And particularly in European countries where there's GDPR. So, whether it's India or anywhere else, there's a lot of groundwork to do before you're sort of really ready to scale up into those countries. And you've got to check, the content, find the right publisher relationships. Obviously, in India, you've got probably hundreds of different languages you potentially could be negotiating. So you probably want to start with Hindi and then maybe move into other languages. But, it's laying all those groundwork pieces in order to be able to do that scaling. And I would just say, let's not forget the measurement piece, because it's really essential for having success in international countries.
Yeah, and it's just so funny to think. So in India, you got to watch out for a real live human, paying another live human to be on their show. Here in the US, we're worried about, was that an AI voice I just heard? It's like, as the channel continues to evolve, and this weekend was big. Podcasting officially crossed the velvet rope. The Golden Globe Awards added Best Podcast for the first time, and Amy Poehler won for Good Hang with Amy Poehler, which people have opinions on that. I know it's not a very old podcast, and that's not niche recognition. That's Hollywood saying podcasts now sit at the same table as film and TV. The signal to brands is huge. Audio isn't the scrappy side channel anymore. It's a prestige medium with cultural weight, stars, and awards to match. Does that feel right to you guys? Is this a moment for you, being in podcasting so long, to see Amy Poehler win that award? Courtney, what do you think?
To see Amy Poehler, who has won a Golden Globe for acting, win a podcast award, yes. I think, it's interesting. And I think Spotify said in this article that it's kind of a stop sign moment for podcasts. And I do agree. Like, I do think that it deserves a moment of recognition that podcast is on the same stage now and is fighting for the same relevance that TV and film is. But I also think, looking at the nominee list, it's very interesting. You have a lot of people in that room. Even the host of SmartList presents the award. You have a lot of people in that room that would have been there anyways, or that have been there before. So while it's very impressive, and obviously congratulations to Amy and her team, but I do think that the nominee list is very interesting and skews a little bit more celebrity driven than maybe what people are actually loving and consuming on a regular basis. But
Great point.
Well, and I think it's interesting, it's like fighting, now is at the same table as film and TV, which are like dying mediums. It's really a story of supplanting, right? Like Netflix is where you go for good television, not the networks. And this is actually like another nail in the coffin of the old broadcast model.
Yeah, I think it's also the flexibility of the channel, meaning like you don't have to drive or fly somewhere to a specific location. Like, you can travel and do these things, and it's another complementary way for these celebrities to have more distribution beyond just movies or shows or things of that nature or whatever. And it's becoming of interest, and the talent agencies reflect and see that. And that's also why you see the biggest movement with some of the bigger talent as those become tent poles for some of these bigger networks. So it's a great validation check mark. I think the money helps validate the check mark, in my opinion. So this is like a nice sugarcoating surface level, this is awesome, this is great. It will only continue to exacerbate things positively. But it wasn't one that was at least for me specifically, it wasn't oh man, thank goodness we finally got a Golden Globe. It's I kind of felt that way 5-6 years ago. But
Yeah, you already had your Golden Globe. Okay, so of the nominees, we'll end on this note. We had Armchair Expert with Dak Shepard, Caller Daddy, Alex Cooper, Good Hang with Amy Poehler, Smartless, Jason Bateman, Will Arnett, and Sean Hayes, the Mel Robbins podcast, and Up First by NPR. Of those, 6, which one would each of you, and myself included, have given best podcast? Armchair Expert, Caller Daddy, Good Hang, Smartless, Mel Robbins, and Up First with NPR. Of those 6 nominees, who would you give the Golden Globe to, Bart?
Define what best means. Like
Right.
that to me, our DNA is programmed into how does it perform for clients. If you're talking,
Then
so I
that's
think
your answer. Then that's your answer.
that
Then
is my answer.
so the
is
best
depending
performing?
upon the best performing ones, which look, they're all strong performers from that perspective for our clients. But if somebody was to say that, I don't think, at least from the media perspective on our side, is like, that's not going to be I'd be like, great, how well are they doing for our clients? That's my response.
Okay, great note. That's our official
We'll do
Oxford
our own
Road.
performance Golden Globes.
Yeah, that's our Oxford Road official answer. Now, as human beings, which one would you give it to? I would give it to Armchair Expert.
I probably would give it to Mel Robbins this year.
Okay, Bart.
I'm still holding firm on my vague answer, non-answer, which is
Okay,
what does
fine,
it say?
fine,
What does it
fine.
say? What does it say in orbit for us in terms of that perspective?
Okay, that's fine. I love it. I love that you're doing that. Giles, do you have one, or you going to do performance too?
I cannot comment really on all of these podcasts because some I favor more than others. So I'm just going to go for Smartless because of my acute bias towards Jason and Will for their Arrested Development contribution to the world.
Okay, all right. So we got a little bit of everything. And at the end of the day, it is true. We just want the ads to work. And that is what Oxford Road is all about. That's what we're going to be doing in 2026, better than we've ever done before. Thank you to our guests for taking part in this important conversation. And thank you for joining the Media Roundtable. Thank you guys for coming on. Giles, Bart, Courtney, thank you so much.
Thank you, Stu. Thank you, everyone.
All right. This podcast is brought to you by Oxford Road, where we want you to succeed in audio and creator-based media to use influence for good. As members of the marketing community, we have the power to advance voices that don't just entertain, but edify, to build bridges across differences and preserve fair-minded discussion. The world needs that around the most important topics of our age. If you're a marketer looking to align your brand values with extraordinary business outcomes, reach out to Oxford Road by visiting oxfordroad.com and subscribing to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. The Media Roundtable love to hear from you. If you have any feedback or suggestions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@mediaroundtable.com, spelled just like it sounds. And I'd also like to make a little plug here for Ad Infinitum. If you haven't heard about it, Ad Infinitum is Oxford Road's audio creative focused podcast, hosted by yours truly, Stu Redwine, Executive Creative Director at Oxford Road. I suggest you start at episode 1 to get a better understanding of what makes audio ads work and how they can work better. Each episode breaks down real recent audio ads from top spenders across podcast, radio streaming, and even SiriusXM. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. And thank you. We're grateful to you listeners, and thank you to our guests and to Haley, Bianca, Kyle, Ezra, Rocio, Neil, and the team at Podcast One. As always, influence responsibly.